Ethan Cole pressed his palm flat against the little girl's forehead, then against the woman's burning cheek, and for the first time in 7 years, his hands shook. He had carried a gun through 3 territories. He had buried his wife with those same hands. He had told himself, sworn to himself, on the coldest night he could remember, that he would never again walk through a door that wasn't his to walk through. And here he was, standing in a stranger's cabin. And he wasn't going anywhere. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me all the way to the end. You are not going to want to miss what comes next. The horse smelled the child before Ethan did. Ranger, a gray quarter horse with 17 years of hard road behind him, and exactly no patience for surprises, pulled up short, without being told, planting all 4 hooves in the dry summer dirt like he'd struck a wall. Ethan felt the shift and reached for his rifle before his eyes found the cause. She was standing in the middle of the trail, not walking, not running, standing. Like she had planted herself there on purpose, like she had decided that whatever came down that road, she was going to stop it with nothing but her own small body. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dress was the color the prairie turned in August, bleached and thin, more air than fabric. Her feet were bare against the cracked dirt, and there were blisters on her heels that had broken and bled and dried without anyone tending to them. Her hair hung loose around a face that should have been soft and round with childhood, but wasn't. It was the face of someone who had been carrying something too heavy for far too long. Ethan kept his hand on the rifle but didn't draw. He watched her eyes. They weren't wild. They weren't confused. They were steady in the way a person's eyes go steady when they've run out of options and decided that the last one, however frightening, is the only one left. "You need to step aside, little miss," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. It always did lately. "Before you spook my horse." "Your horse ain't spooked," she said. He looked at Ranger. Ranger stood perfectly still, ears forward, watching the child with an expression that Ethan could only describe as attentive. "No," he admitted. "He ain't." "I need you to come with me," the girl said. Her chin came up when she said it, like she'd rehearsed it, like she'd stood in that trail and practiced the words until they sounded brave enough. "Please, I need you to come home with me. My mama is dying." Ethan looked down the trail ahead. He looked behind him. He looked at the flat, shimmering horizon and the white summer sky, and the emptiness that stretched in every direction, like the land itself was trying to tell him something. "How far?" he said finally. She pointed back the way she'd come through a stand of cottonwoods that lined a dry creek bed. "Not far. I can run fast." "I didn't say I was coming." "I know." She didn't move. "But you're still here." He sat with that for a moment. The sun pushed down on his shoulders like a physical weight. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, a single bird called twice and went quiet. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily," she said. "Lily Warren." "How long has your mama been sick?" "4 days." Something crossed her face, then a crack in all that practiced steadiness. Just a small one. Just enough to show him what was underneath. "She won't eat. She won't wake up all the way. She talked last night, but she didn't make sense. She kept saying my daddy's name." She stopped, swallowed. "My daddy's been dead 2 years." Ethan was off Ranger before he'd decided to be. He tied the reins to a low branch and crouched down until he was level with the girl's eyes. Up close he could see the dried tear tracks in the dust on her face. He could see the raw skin on her bare feet. He could see that she hadn't slept, probably not in days, because the shadows under her eyes were the deep gray-purple of true exhaustion. "Is there anyone else?" he said. "Any neighbor, anyone in town you went to?" Something happened in her expression that he hadn't expected. It wasn't sadness. It was older than sadness. It was the particular blankness of someone who had already been refused. "I went to the Calder place first," she said. "Mrs. Calder told me she couldn't get involved in Warren business. Said it wasn't safe." She said the words carefully, like she was reporting facts, not feelings. Like feelings had stopped being useful. "Then I went to Reverend Holt. He prayed with me for a while. Then he said the same thing. Said it wasn't safe." Her jaw tightened. Then I walked to town. How far is town? 6 miles. He stared at her. At those bare, blistered feet. 6 miles. I went to the doctor first, she continued. Dr. Briggs. He said he couldn't come without payment, and we don't have... She stopped. The crack in her voice was just a hairline fracture just barely there, and she pushed through it like she was pushing through a wall. He said he was sorry. Then I went to the sheriff. Sheriff Dawes said it wasn't his concern if a woman got sick on her own land. Then I walked back. You walked back 6 miles. I had to. She said it simply. There wasn't anyone else. Ethan stood up slowly. He looked at the cottonwoods. He looked at the trail. I thought about the years he'd spent telling himself that the worst thing a man could do was let himself get tangled up in other people's troubles. He'd told himself that after Rebecca died. He'd told himself that when he turned in his badge in Billings. He'd told himself that every morning for 7 years, as he woke up in a different town, Ada alone rode on. Lead the way, Lily, he said. She looked at him for a moment, like she was checking to make sure he was real, like she'd been disappointed before, and needed a second to believe this wasn't going to be another one of those times, and then she turned and ran toward the cottonwoods. He followed with Ranger at his side. The homestead came into view through the trees. A small cabin and a leaning barn set against a rise of dry grass, with a garden that was struggling gamely against the summer heat and losing. There was a rope line between 2 posts with 3 pieces of laundry on it, bone dry and still. There was a water pump near the cabin door with a tin bucket underneath it. A cat watched them from the top of the fence post and did not run. Ethan pushed open this cabin door and the heat inside hit him like a fist. Margaret Warren was lying on a narrow bed against the far wall. She was a woman in her mid-30s, or she had been before the fever. Now she looked older and smaller, a figure made of pale skin and damp hair and labored breathing. Her cheeks were burning red against the white of her face. Her hands resting on top of the thin blanket were still and curled slightly inward, like flowers closing at night. Lily went straight to her mother's side and took one of those hands in both of hers. "Mama," she said quietly. "Mama, I brought someone." Margaret didn't open her eyes. Ethan crossed the room in 4 steps and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, the way his own mother had once pressed it to his. The heat was immediate and alarming, not the warm flush of a mild fever, but the deep baking heat of a body in a serious fight. He pulled his hand back and looked around the cabin. A small table, 2 chairs, a fireplace that was lit because the summer heat made lighting it unthinkable. A shelf with a handful of items: cornmeal, a nearly empty salt tin, 3 glass jars, a Bible. A single window with the shutter propped half open. A bucket on the floor near the bed with a damp cloth draped over its edge. "You've been putting cold cloths on her," he said. "Yes, sir." Lily was still holding her mother's hand. "But the water gets warm fast, and I keep having to go to the pump." "When did she last drink water?" "This morning. A little. I got her to take a little." He pulled the cloth from the bucket, wrung it out, and laid it across Margaret's forehead. She made a small sound, not words, just a sound like acknowledgement, and was still again. "All right," Ethan said, more to himself than to the child. He straightened up and looked at Lily, who was watching him with those steady, exhausted eyes. "I need you to listen to me carefully. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "I'm going to need a lot of cold water. More than that bucket can hold. Is there a larger container somewhere? A barrel, a second bucket, anything?" "There's a barrel in the barn. Go get it and put it under the pump. Fill it as full as you can manage, then come back inside." She was already moving toward the door before he'd finished. He watched her go, this small, blistered, sleepless child who had walked 12 miles in one day trying to save her mother's life, and he felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't quite grief, and it wasn't quite anger. It was the particular ache of witnessing courage that shouldn't have been necessary. He turned back to Margaret and began doing what he knew how to do. He'd learned about fever management from an old army doctor outside of Fort Benton, a quiet, precise man who'd said that most people survived fevers that were properly treated and died from fevers that weren't. Not because the fever itself was always fatal, but because dehydration and heat and helplessness made it fatal. The body could fight if it was given a chance. His job right now was to give Margaret Warren's body a chance. He kept the cloth cold and changed it every few minutes. He got small amounts of water into her, a spoonful at a time, tilting her head gently, watching to make sure she swallowed. He found a second thin blanket in a cedar chest and soaked one edge of it in cold water to drape over her legs. Lily came back with the barrel, rolling it through the cabin door with her whole body's weight behind it. Ethan helped her position it and told her she'd done well. She nodded and came to sit beside the bed again. "Has she said anything?" the girl asked. "Since you've been here?" "Not yet. That's all right. She doesn't need to talk right now. She needs to rest. She's been talking in her sleep, about my daddy, and about some papers. She keeps saying something about papers." He glanced up. "Papers. I don't know what she means." Lily smoothed the edge of the blanket near her mother's hand. "We had some trouble. About the land. A man came a few months back, a big man with 2 other men, and said we owed money we didn't owe. Said the land might not be ours anymore. Mama got real upset." She paused. "After that she started looking sick. I don't know if it was worry or if she really got sick from something. I don't know." Ethan kept his expression level. But something in him went quiet and alert, in the way it used to go quiet and alert when he wore a badge and someone told him something that didn't add up right. "What's this man's name?" he asked. "The one who came about the land. Mr. Voss." She said the name without any particular emotion, which told him that she'd reached the point of numbness about it. "Clayton Voss. He owns a lot of land around here. Mama said he's been buying up other farms too, except buying wasn't really the right word." "No," Ethan said. "I don't reckon it was." He filed the name away in the back of his mind and turned his attention back to Margaret. By mid-afternoon, the color of the fever had shifted slightly. Not gone, not even close to gone, but the furious red had softened a degree or two. Margaret had woken twice in brief, confused intervals. The first time she'd looked at Ethan and drawn back against the pillow alarmed, and Lily had squeezed her hand and said quickly, "It's all right, Mama." He stopped to help. Margaret had looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she'd looked back at Ethan with the flat, unreadable gaze of a woman who had been disappointed too many times to trust a stranger easily. "Why?" she said. Her voice was barely a thread. "Why would you stop?" He met her eyes. "Because your daughter asked me to, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment. Then her eyes closed again, and she was gone back into the fever. The second time she woke, it was nearly evening. She managed to drink half a cup of water on her own, which Lily watched with the intense, contained relief of a child trying not to cry. Then Margaret looked up at the ceiling and said, "The land papers, in the Bible." Her voice was clearer this time, urgent even. "Tell him about the land papers, in the Bible." "Mama." Lily leaned forward. "Mama, stay awake. Tell me what you mean." But she was already drifting again. Ethan looked at the shelf, at the Bible sitting between the cornmeal and the salt tin. He looked at Lily. "May I?" he said. She nodded. He crossed to the shelf and lifted the Bible carefully. It was heavier than the pages alone could account for, and when he opened it, he understood why. Folded inside the front cover and tucked between the first pages were documents. Land documents, a deed, a survey record, letters. He spread them on the table and began to read. How as a man who had spent years in law enforcement, and he knew what legitimate land documents looked like, and he knew what forged ones looked like, and he knew the particular texture of legal manipulation when it was laid out in black and white in front of him. What he was looking at told him several things clearly. The Warren family had owned this land for 9 years. The deed was registered, dated, witnessed by 2 county officials, and filed in the Territory Land Office in Helena. There was no debt attached to it. There was no lien. There was no legal claim outstanding against this property of any kind. Whatever Clayton Voss had told Margaret Warren, he had lied. And a man who lied about a land claim, who sent 2 men along to deliver the message, who made sure the lie landed on a widowed woman with a child and no husband, to push back. That was a man who'd done this before. That was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Ethan sat down at the table with the papers in front of him and stayed there for a long time thinking. Lily watched him from her place beside her mother. "What does it say?" she finally asked. He looked up. He thought about the right way to explain what he'd found to this particular child who had walked 12 miles barefoot and stood in the middle of a trail to stop a stranger and asked for help with nothing but courage and desperation holding her up. "It says," he told her carefully, "that this land belongs to your family. It always has." She stared at him. "Then why?" "Because sometimes people lie, Lily." He said it without softening it, because she'd already lived it, and she deserved the plain truth. And when someone powerful lies, the people around them often believe it, or pretend to. She thought about that. "The neighbors," she said slowly. "Mrs. Calder. She said it wasn't safe. She knew. Maybe. Or maybe she was just afraid of the wrong person." "Are you afraid of him?" He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. And he meant it not as bravado, but as fact. He'd been afraid of things in his life. Genuinely afraid in the bone-deep way that changes a person. He wasn't afraid of Clayton Voss. "Why not?" she asked. "Because I know what he is," Ethan said. "And knowing what something is takes most of the fear out of it." Outside the sun was going down, painting the cabin walls gold through the half-open shutter. In the distance a coyote called once and went quiet. The wind picked up for a moment, brushing through the cottonwoods, and then it died again. Ethan folded the papers carefully and put them back in the Bible. He set the Bible back on the shelf. "I'm going to stay tonight," he said, "in case she takes a turn. If she makes it through the night with the fever coming down, that's a good sign." Lily looked at him with those serious two-old eyes. "You don't have to," she said. "You already stayed all day. That's more than anyone else did." "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's not really the point." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going to leave in the morning?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at Margaret Warren's face, which was still flushed, but quieter now. He thought about the papers in the Bible. He thought about Clayton Voss. He thought about a 6-year-old, no 8-year-old child walking barefoot through summer heat for 12 miles, because every adult in reasonable distance had decided that it wasn't their problem. "I reckon that depends on how your mama is doing in the morning," he said finally. Lily seemed to accept that. She turned back to her mother and took her hand again, and sat quietly in the way that people sit when they've been sitting vigil for so long that stillness has become its own kind of action. Ethan then pulled his chair to the other side of the bed and sat down too. The cabin grew dark around them slowly. The cat from the fence post came in through the half-open shutter and settled at the foot of the bed with an air of prior ownership. Lily fell asleep in her chair sometime around the 3rd hour, still holding her mother's hand. Ethan sat and listened to Margaret breathe. Around midnight, the breathing changed. It steadied. The small labored catches between each breath smoothed out into something longer and slower, something that sounded less like fighting and more like rest. He leaned forward and pressed his hand to her forehead. The fire was still there, but it was lower now. Not out, but lower. He sat back in his chair and looked at this woman he didn't know. In this cabin, he had no business being in the middle of a situation that was going to be a great deal more complicated than one night of cold cloths and water. He thought about riding on. He thought about it honestly and clearly, the way he'd made himself think about hard things since Rebecca died. Not pretending the option wasn't there, not lying to himself about what the easier choice was. Then he looked at Lily's hand still wrapped around her mother's even in sleep. And he sat back in his chair and stayed where he was. By the time the first gray light came through the shutter, Margaret Warren's fever had broken. She woke to find a stranger sitting in the chair on the other side of her bed, hat in his lap, eyes dark with a night of no sleep, watching her with the careful attention of a man who has been waiting for something to happen and is glad that the thing that happened was this. She stared at him. "You stayed?" she said. Her voice was raw and weak but present, real, herself. "Yes, ma'am." "All night." "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the cabin, birds were starting the early morning chorus that always sounded to Ethan more like argument than music. Lily brought you, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. She did. Margaret turned her head to look at her daughter, still asleep in the chair face, finally soft in the way children's faces are supposed to be, the vigilance and the exhaustion, temporarily released. Something moved across Margaret's face, a grief and a fierceness, and a love, all rolled into one expression that had no name for it. She walked to town, Margaret said quietly. Didn't she? All the way to town. And back, Ethan said. A long silence. What's your name? She said. Ethan Cole, ma'am. Ethan Cole. She said it like she was measuring it, like she was deciding whether to trust the sound of it. Why did you stop, Mr. Cole? People don't stop for us. That's been made fairly clear. He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because your daughter stood in the middle of the trail, he said. And she asked me to. Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were wet. Not crying, not quite, but close. I found papers, he said carefully. In the Bible. About the land. Her eyes sharpened immediately. Fever, weakness, and exhaustion briefly replaced by something harder and more alert. You read them? Yes, ma'am. I was a lawman for 15 years. I know what I was looking at. Your land claim is legitimate. Whatever Voss told you, he lied. Her jaw set. I knew he lied, but I didn't know. She stopped. I didn't know how to fight it. I don't have money for a lawyer. I don't have a husband. I have Lily, and I have this land, and I have 9 years of work in every fence post and every furrow out there. And he looked me in the face and told me it was all going to be taken, and there wasn't a thing I could do. He was wrong about that last part, Ethan said. She looked at him. At this stranger who had sat in her cabin all night and read her legal documents and was now telling her in the gray early morning light that she had something worth fighting for and that the fight wasn't over. You don't owe us anything, she said. Her voice was careful, measured. You stopped. You helped. That's more than enough. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. It was the second time he'd said that in the last 12 hours to 2 different Warrens, and it still meant the same thing both times. That's not really the point, ma'am. Something in her face shifted. Not trust, not yet. Trust took longer than a night and a conversation. But something adjacent to it. An openness. A willingness to consider the possibility. In the chair beside her, Lily stirred, blinked, and then sat up very straight in the way children do when they've been asleep in an unexpected place and need a moment to remember why. She looked at her mother, then at Ethan, then back at her mother. Mama, she said softly, you're awake. I'm awake, baby. Your fever. Lily pressed her small hand to her mother's forehead, exactly the way she'd watched Ethan do it a dozen times through the night. Her face shifted. It's lower. It's so much lower. I know. Lily looked at Ethan. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He picked up his hat from his lap and turned it once in his hands, a habit, an old one, something he did when he was making a decision. Then he set it back on his knee. I'll go pump some fresh water, he said, standing. Then I'll see about the horses. Margaret started. I know, he said. Ma'am. He walked to the door and pushed it open into the new morning. The sun was just clearing the horizon, laying long gold lines across the dry grass and the leaning barn and the fence posts and the garden and all the hard-won evidence of 9 years of work. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. Then he went to pump the water. The pump handle was cold in Ethan's hands at that hour, the kind of cold that didn't make sense given how brutal the day before had been, and he pumped it steady and slow, watching the water come clear and listening to the cabin behind him. He could hear Lily's voice through the open door. Couldn't make out the words, just the tone of it, that particular soft urgency children use when they're talking to someone they've been terrified of losing. He kept pumping. He didn't look back. Some moments weren't his to witness. He carried the full bucket inside, set it near the bed, and found Margaret sitting up against the headboard with Lily tucked under her arm. It was the first time he'd seen her upright. She looked fragile and determined in equal measure the way people look when they've been forced to discover how strong they actually are. You need to eat something, he said. There isn't much. Lily said quietly. Not ashamed, just honest. I went to the shelf, looked at what was there, came back and crouched by the fireplace. I'll make cornmeal. It's not much, but it's hot and it'll settle. You cook, Margaret said. I've been feeding myself alone for 7 years, ma'am. A man figures it out or he goes hungry. Something flickered in her expression. Not quite amusement, but something close to it. Something that told him the woman underneath the fever and the fear had a spine of iron and a sharp enough mind to notice the world, even when the world was crushing her. She watched him work without speaking, and he could feel her watching, and he understood it. She was assessing him, deciding how much of what he'd done was real and how much of it might have a price she couldn't see yet. I didn't blame her for that. He'd have done the same. He got the cornmeal onto the fire and stayed crouched there, stirring it slow. Lily came and sat beside him on the hearth, close but not quite touching, the way children position themselves near people they've decided to trust, but aren't ready to show it yet. Mr. Cole, she said. Ethan's fine. She considered that. Ethan? Are you going to talk to someone about Mr. Voss? I'm thinking on it. Thinking isn't doing, she said. He looked at her sideways. No, it isn't. But doing the wrong thing is worse than thinking a little longer. She seemed to accept that. She watched the fire. There's a man in town, Mr. Tucker, Samuel Tucker. He's a lawyer. Mama went to him when Voss first came. He wasn't unkind. He just said without more evidence there wasn't much he could do. She paused. But you found the papers. I did. That's evidence. It is, he said. Then we should go see Mr. Tucker. He looked at her again. 8-year-old blisters on her feet, hadn't slept in days, and already building a legal strategy. Your mama needs a few more days before anyone goes anywhere, he said. I know that. She said it with the patience of someone who has learned that knowing something and being able to act on it are two different things. I'm just saying, when she's ready. He nodded. When she's ready. From the bed, Margaret said, I can hear you both, you know. Lily looked over her shoulder. We know, Mama. I'm not an invalid. My mind works perfectly well. Yes, ma'am, Ethan said. No one said it didn't. A pause. Then Margaret said, Lily's right. Tucker is a decent man. He was honest with me about the limits of what he could do. If those papers show what you say they show, he needs to see them. He will, Ethan said. He got the cornmeal off the fire and portioned it out. He gave most of it to Lily and a smaller amount to Margaret, with instructions to take it slow. He ate the remainder standing near the door, looking out at the barn, already cataloging in his head what needed doing. The fence along the north side had been down long enough that the posts had started to lean. The barn door was hanging by one hinge. The water trough had a crack along the bottom seam that was losing water to the dry ground underneath it. None of that was going to fix itself. He set down his bowl and went outside. He found the tools in the barn, older, worn smooth with use but solid. A hammer that had been a good hammer once and still was. A coil of wire. A post mallet. He took what he needed and walked to the north fence and started working. I didn't think about why he was doing it. Thinking about why led to the kind of circular reasoning that got a man nowhere. He just worked. The sun climbed and the heat built, and he kept working, and after about an hour, he heard footsteps behind him and didn't turn. You're fixing the fence, Lily said. Appears so. Mama says you don't have to do that. Tell your mama I know. A short silence. Then the sound of Lily settling herself on top of the fence rail nearby, the creak of old wood, the small shift of weight. Can I watch? Suit yourself. She watched him work for a while without speaking, which he appreciated. Most people couldn't stand silence. They filled it with noise that didn't mean anything just to prove they were still there. Lily just sat and watched and let the silence be what it was. My daddy built this fence, she said finally. He kept working. Before I was born mostly. He added sections after. He used to check it every spring. A pause. He taught me how to check it too. Walk the whole line and look for soft posts and broken wire. I tried to do it after he died, but I couldn't reach to fix things properly. I just noted where the problems were, and then couldn't do anything about them. Ethan straightened up and looked at the length of fence ahead of him. You kept track of where every problem was. Yes. Then you're going to walk me down the line and show me every one, he said. That'll save me an hour of looking. She was off the rail immediately. Come on then, she said, already moving. There's a bad section about 30 yards east where 2 posts are both soft. That's the worst one. He followed her down the line. She showed him every weak post, every break in the wire, every place where the ground had heaved and loosened the anchor. She'd been right. She'd tracked it all, held the whole map of it in her head for however long she'd been carrying it alone. When he fixed each section, she watched with a focused attention that told him she was memorizing the method, filing it away for future use, already planning for a future where she might have to know how to do it herself. That thought hit him somewhere unguarded, and he pushed past it and kept working. By midday, the north fence was solid. He moved to the barn door. Lily handed him nails without being asked, passing them one at a time with the quiet competence of someone who'd assisted with repairs before, who knew the rhythm of it. Ethan, she said somewhere in the middle of the second hinge. Yeah. Why were you running? He stopped with the hammer mid-swing. Let it come down easy. What makes you think I was running? Because when I stopped you on the trail, you weren't going anywhere, she said. You were just going. There's a difference. People who are going somewhere have a destination in their eyes. You didn't. He looked at her. This 8-year-old with the blistered feet and the steady gaze and the vocabulary of someone decades older. My wife died, he said. He didn't plan to say it. It came out anyway. 4 years ago. Before that I was a lawman. After that I wasn't anything in particular. Lily was quiet for a moment. What was her name? Rebecca. Did she know you could fix fences? Something happened in his chest. It wasn't quite grief, and it wasn't quite a laugh. She did, he said. She said it was the only truly useful thing about me. She sounds like she was funny. She was, he said. And then because it was true, and because this child had earned the truth, she was the best person I ever knew. Lily nodded seriously. I think my mama might be like that too, she said. Most people around here don't know it because she doesn't have anyone to show it to. But I know it. He picked up the hammer again. Then it's a good thing someone stood in the trail and stopped the right person, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she handed him the next nail, and they went back to work. Margaret was on her feet by late afternoon. Not far, just to the chair by the table, moving slowly with one hand on the wall, waving off Ethan's instinct to step forward, with a look that said clearly she did not require assistance and would prefer he mind his business. He minded his business. She got to the chair on her own and sat down in it with the controlled exhale of someone who has just done something harder than it looked and is not going to admit it. The cornmeal's gone, she said. There's dried beans in the barrel in the corner, if you're planning to stay for supper. I can do beans, he said. I can do them myself. I know you can, ma'am. But you're not going to because you've been fighting a fever for 4 days and you're sitting in a chair right now instead of your bed only because you're too stubborn to stay horizontal. He said it evenly without heat. So sit, and let me do the beans. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts irritation and something that might have been respect or the beginning of it. Stubborn, she repeated. Yes, ma'am. That's a word. She folded her hands on the table. All right, the beans. He cooked. Lily sat across from her mother, and they talked in low voices about the garden, about the cat, about small ordinary things that had been interrupted by the fever and now needed to be resumed. He listened without appearing. The old lawman habit of taking in information from his peripheral attention, and what he heard was a mother and daughter who had built their own complete world out of necessity, a world of small rituals and private language, and the particular closeness that comes from having survived things together. It occurred to him that breaking into that world, even with good intentions, was something that needed to be done carefully, or not at all. After supper, when Lily had fallen asleep early with the sudden completeness of a child who's been running on emergency energy for days and has finally allowed herself to stop, Ethan and Margaret sat at opposite ends of the table in the lamplight and talked. Really talked. For the first time. Tell me about Voss, he said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He came in March, early March when the ground was still frozen. 2 men with him, neither one of them local. He stood in this room. She looked at the space around her with an expression that said the memory of it still contaminated the air. And he told me my husband had borrowed money before he died. Said there was a note attached to the land. Said the note was past due and the land would be seized if I couldn't pay. She paused. He had papers with him. I don't know enough about legal documents to know what they were, but they looked real enough to scare me. They weren't, Ethan said. Her jaw tightened. I know that now. But I didn't have anyone to look at them and tell me that. I went to Tucker, and he said without seeing the originals, there wasn't much he could do. Voss kept the originals. Of course he did. And the neighbors? She stopped. Something moved across her face. Not anger exactly, colder than anger. The particular hurt of betrayal from people you'd trusted. The Calders have been our neighbors for 6 years. Ed Calder and my husband used to trade seed every spring. And he wouldn't. His wife told Lily it wasn't safe to get involved. She set down the cup. I understand fear. I'm not naive about what Voss can do to people who push back. But I had believed that people would do the right thing anyway, Ethan said. Yes. Flat and quiet. I had believed that. He was silent for a moment. The papers in the Bible. Where did you get them? My husband was careful, she said. James was a careful man. He filed everything, kept copies. He always said the land was the one thing that couldn't be taken if the paperwork was right. She looked at the shelf where the Bible sat. He put the copies in there 3 months before he died. I think he knew he was getting worse. I think he was doing what he could for us. Her voice stayed steady, but something behind her eyes wasn't. He knew he wouldn't always be here to fight for it himself. Ethan looked at the Bible on the shelf. At the 9 years of work, visible in every corner of this cabin, in every fence post he'd repaired that afternoon, in every row of the struggling garden outside. Your husband was right, he said. The paperwork is good, and Voss's claim is fabricated. There's no note, there's no debt, there's nothing legitimate behind any of what he told you. He paused. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. She met his eyes directly. All right. Is there anything you're not telling me? Anything about the land, the finances, the history of the claim, anything that might complicate what I found in those papers? She held his gaze without blinking. No, she said. The land is ours. Clean and clear. James worked for 2 years to pay off the original purchase before he'd agree to file the deed. He didn't believe in debt. He didn't believe in owing. She paused. There is no note. There never was. Voss made it up from nothing. Then Tucker can fight it, Ethan said. With the right documents and the right argument he can fight it. And if Voss retaliates. She said it quietly but steadily, the way a person says something they've been holding in the back of their mind for months. He's not the kind of man who accepts losing quietly. Whatever he does in a courtroom, what he does outside of one. One thing at a time, ma'am. That's easy to say. I know it is. He looked at her. But you've already gotten through the hardest part. She raised an eyebrow slightly. You think surviving a fever is the hardest part? No, he said. I think deciding to fight instead of giving up is the hardest part. And you already made that decision. You made it when you put those papers in the Bible. Your husband made it when he filed that deed. He paused. Lily made it when she stood in the middle of a trail and stopped a stranger. Margaret looked at her daughter's sleeping face across the room. Something shifted in her expression that complicated grief love, that had no name for it. She's too young to carry this, she said softly. She won't have to much longer, Ethan said. I give you my word on that. She looked back at him. A long look. The kind where you're trying to read what's underneath the surface of a person, trying to find the crack, or the angle, or the thing that explains why someone would do what this man had done. Why? She said, quiet and direct. Not the answer you gave me this morning. The real one. Why are you still here? He thought about that honestly. Because I've spent 7 years riding past things that were my business, he said finally. And I'm tired of it. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and looked at it and set it back down. "The beans were good," she said. "Thank you, ma'am." "You can call me Margaret." He nodded once. "Margaret." Outside in the dark. Something moved along the fence line, probably just a coyote, probably nothing. But Ethan's eyes went to the door automatically, the old lawman reflex, and stayed there for a beat before he looked away. It wasn't a coyote. He didn't say that to Margaret. Not tonight. Tonight she needed rest, and so did Lily, and so, if he was honest, did he. But he sat in the chair by the door after she went back to bed, and he kept his rifle across his knees, and he didn't sleep, because whoever had been walking that fence line in the dark had stopped at the north section, the section he'd repaired that afternoon, and stood there long enough to take a good look at the cabin. And that meant someone already knew that things at the Warren homestead had changed. He was still in that chair when the sun came up. Margaret found him there when she walked out of the bedroom. Rifle across his knees, hat pulled low, eyes open, and watching the door with the particular stillness of a man who has spent a night on guard and is trying not to show how much it cost him. She stopped when she saw him, looked at the rifle, looked at his face. "How long have you been sitting there?" she said. "A while." "That's not an answer." "No, ma'am, it isn't." She crossed to the fireplace and started building the morning fire with the quick, practiced movements of someone who has done it 10,000 times. She didn't ask again about the rifle, but he could tell from the set of her shoulders that she hadn't missed it, and she wasn't going to pretend she had. "Someone walked the fence line last night," he said. "East side, stopped near the cabin for a while, then left." Her hands went still on the kindling, just for a moment, then she kept moving. "Voss's men," she said. "Most likely. They've done it before. First time was in April, then twice in May." She struck the match without looking at him. "I stopped telling Lily. There wasn't anything she could do about it, and it just frightened her." "You should have gone to the sheriff." "I did." The fire caught. She sat back on her heels. "Sheriff Dawes told me I couldn't prove it was Voss's men. Said people walk land all the time. Said he couldn't do anything without evidence of an actual crime." She turned and looked at Ethan with flat, clear eyes. "He also told me very quietly on my way out of his office that Clayton Voss was a man who took care of the people who took care of him, and that I might want to think carefully about how much trouble I wanted to make." The fire snapped and popped between them. "He threatened you," Ethan said. "He advised me," she said. "That's what he'd call it." Ethan set the rifle against the wall and stood up slowly, working the stiffness out of his back. "We're going to town today," he said. She turned to look at him. "I'm not strong enough to." "You're not going. I am. I'm going to see Tucker." "Ethan, the men on the fence line last night weren't there by accident," he said. "Voss knows something changed here. That means we don't have the time I thought we had." He picked up his hat. "I need Tucker to look at those papers before Voss makes his next move." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tucker's office is on the main street, across from the feed store. He has a young associate boy named Peters. Don't talk to Peters if you can help it. He's Voss's nephew." Ethan stopped. "His nephew works for Tucker. Has for 8 months." She met his eyes. "Convenient, isn't it?" He stood still with that for a moment. In 15 years of law enforcement, he had learned that corruption was almost never loud. It was almost always quiet. It wore respectable clothes and had an office on the main street and a young face that nobody looked at twice. "I'll be careful," he said. "Be more than careful." She stood up from the fireplace and faced him directly. "Whatever you find in that office, whatever. Tucker says, don't let Peters know what's in those papers. Don't let him know what you have. The moment Voss knows we have legal documentation that contradicts his claim, whatever restraint he's been showing disappears." "Understood." Lily appeared in the bedroom doorway in her nightgown, hair loose, eyes still soft with sleep. She looked at Ethan with his hat in his hand and her mother standing straight-backed by the fireplace, and understood immediately that something was happening. "What's going on?" she said. "Mr. Cole is going to town," Margaret said. Her voice had shifted back to calm, the deliberate calm of a mother managing what her child absorbs. "To see Mr. Tucker." Lily looked at Ethan. About the papers. About the papers, he confirmed. She nodded once slowly with the gravity of someone being included in a decision rather than protected from it. All right, she said. Come back. He looked at her. I will. I mean it, she said. Don't just say it. Come back. He held her gaze for a moment. I give you my word, Lily. She studied him a second longer, decided to believe him, and went to help her mother with breakfast. The ride into town took 40 minutes on Ranger, and Ethan used every one of them to think. He turned the situation over in his mind, the way he used to turn cases over when he wore a badge, looking at each surface, each angle, each point where the facts didn't fit cleanly together. The fence line watchers. The corrupt sheriff. Voss's nephew inside Tucker's office. The fabricated debt, the forged claim, the fear that had spread through the entire community like something in the water. This wasn't opportunism. This was a system. Voss had built it carefully, piece by piece, and the Warren land wasn't the first target, and probably wasn't the last. A man didn't construct this kind of network for one homestead, which meant Tucker would know more than he'd told Margaret. Whether he'd tell Ethan was a different question. He found Tucker's office without difficulty and tied Ranger at the rail outside. Through the window he could see a young man at a front desk. Peters had to be sandy-haired and alert, in the way of someone whose job is to manage who gets through the door. Ethan pushed inside before Peters could arrange his face into a professional expression. I need to see Mr. Tucker, Ethan said. Do you have an appointment? I don't. Tell him Ethan Cole is here about the Warren land claim. Tell him it's urgent. Peters's eyes flickered just slightly, just a fraction of a second at the name Warren. Ethan caught it and filed it away. Mr. Tucker is in a meeting. Tell him, Ethan said. Quiet, not threatening, just absolute. Peters got up and went through the inner door. Ethan stood exactly where he was and did not look around the office in any way that might seem like he was looking around the office. He looked at the front wall. He waited. Tucker came out 2 minutes later. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, with silver at his temples and the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades reading people across a desk. He looked at Ethan the way he would look at a document he hadn't seen before, attentive, non-committal, reserving judgment. Mr. Cole, he said, come in. The inner office had no other occupant, which meant the meeting had been fiction. Ethan sat across the desk from Tucker and placed the folded land papers between them without preamble. These belong to Margaret Warren, he said. I think you'll find them relevant to the claim Voss has been making against her land. Tucker looked at the papers without touching them. Where did these come from? She's had them since her husband filed the deed. They were in the cabin. She didn't show me these when she came to see me. She didn't know what she had. Her husband stored them before he died. Ethan paused. Go ahead and look. Tucker picked up the papers and read. He was a practiced reader. His face didn't change much, but his eyes moved with a focused speed that told Ethan he was understanding exactly what he was seeing. He read everything twice. Then he set the papers down with the careful deliberateness of someone who is thinking very hard about what to say next. This deed is legitimate, Tucker said. I know it is. The filing date, the witnesses, the registration number, this is all verifiable through the Helena Land office. He looked up. Voss's entire claim falls apart against this. I know that too, Ethan said. What I want to know is what you know about Voss that you didn't tell Mrs. Warren when she came to see you. Tucker went very still. I told her the truth, he said. Without documentation. I'm not asking about then, Ethan said. I'm asking about now. You're a lawyer who's been practicing in this territory for 20 years? You know every land transaction in this county. You know Clayton Voss. And you know that what he did to the Warrens, he's done to other families. He leaned forward slightly. I need to know how many. The silence in the office stretched out long enough to become its own kind of answer. Then Tucker opened his desk drawer and pulled out a file that was considerably thicker than anything to do with just one family. He put it on the desk next to the Warren papers and looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who has been waiting for permission to do something he already knew was right. 6 families, Tucker said, that I can document. There may be more who were too frightened to come to me at all. He opened the file. All of them received visits from Voss or his men. Fabricated debt claims. Forged documentation. All of them either sold under pressure or are still holding on by their fingernails waiting to see what happens. He paused. The Warren case is the most recent. Also the most clearly documented on the legitimate side, which is probably why Voss has been slower to escalate with them. He knows a solid deed makes things complicated. Not slow enough, Ethan said. He had men on the fence line last night. Tucker's jaw tightened. How is Mrs. Warren? Recovering. She had a fever. She's stronger than she looks, and she's not going to be run off that land. He met Tucker's eyes. But she needs more than one man watching the fence line. She needs this in front of a judge before Voss decides that legal complications are less of a problem than he thought. I agree, Tucker said. With these documents and the testimony of the other affected families, if I can get them to come forward, we have a genuine case. Fraud, forgery, coercion. This could go well beyond the Warren land claim. He straightened the papers carefully. But I need to be honest with you, Mr. Cole. Voss has reach. He has money. And he has... Tucker's eyes moved briefly toward the outer office, and back ears in places they shouldn't be. His nephew, Ethan said flatly. Tucker's face showed something not quite guilt, but the complex expression of a man who has been navigating a compromise he doesn't like and knows it. Peters applied for the position 8 months ago. By the time I understood the situation fully, he'd been here long enough that removing him without cause would tip Voss off, Ethan said. Yes. Ethan looked at the file on the desk. At the 6 families documented inside it. At the careful, patient work of a lawyer who had been building something quietly, waiting for the piece that would make it viable. You were waiting for documentation, Ethan said slowly. You've been building this case for months. You just didn't have anything solid enough to take to a judge. Tucker met his eyes. I've been waiting for someone to walk through that door with exactly what you just put on this desk. A pause. The Warren deed is the clearest of all of them. It's the one that makes the fraud undeniable. Then use it, Ethan said. All of it. Take it to Helena. Take it to Judge Morrison if you have to go above the county level, and given Sheriff Dawes' situation, you do. Don't file anything locally. Don't talk to anyone local. And get Peters out of your office before the end of the day. Tucker blinked. On what grounds? Fire him for cause or invent a reason, or tell him the position's been eliminated. I don't care how you do it. But he cannot be in this building when you start making telegraph inquiries to Helena. Ethan stood. How long do you need to prepare what you have? 3 days, maybe 4. You have 2. He picked up the Warren papers from the desk. I'm keeping these. I'll bring them back when you're ready to file. I don't want them here while Peters is still in that outer office. Tucker looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood and extended his hand. You said you were a lawman. Former. I think that might be a matter of perspective, Tucker said. Ethan shook his hand and walked back through the outer office without looking at Peters and out into the street. He untied Ranger and swung up and rode the first half-mile out of town before he let himself think about what Tucker had said. 6 families. I thought about the weight of that. 6 families who had received the same visit, the same fabricated debt, the same quiet terror of watching something they'd built with their hands being threatened by a man with forged papers and paid muscle and a sheriff in his pocket. 6 families who had either given up or were still holding on alone waiting. He was 4 miles out of town when Ranger's ears went flat. Ethan had his rifle up before his conscious mind had finished processing why. 2 riders were coming out of the tree line on his left, angling to cut the road ahead of him. Not fast, not a chase. A deliberate positioning. The kind that said we want to talk, and was actually a way of saying we want you to know we're watching. He kept Ranger at a steady walk and met them on the road. The closer one was a big man wide through the shoulders, a face that had taken some hits in its time, eyes that were professionally flat. The kind of flat that wasn't natural, but was practiced. He held his reins loose and easy, which meant his hands were free, which meant he wanted Ethan to notice that. Mr. Cole, the big man said. Ethan didn't ask how he knew his name. He already knew the answer. You have business with me, Mr. Voss wanted us to pass along some information, the man said. His tone was almost friendly. Almost. He understands you've been spending some time out at the Warren property, helping out. Real neighborly. He wanted you to know he's got no quarrel with you personally. That's generous of him, Ethan said. He's a generous man. He also wanted to make sure you understand that the matter of the Warren land is a legal one, a financial one, and that it's not really the kind of thing that benefits from a pause outside involvement. I appreciated the message, Ethan said. Tell Mr. Voss I'll take it under consideration. The big man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. He also wanted me to mention that he knew Rebecca. Everything in Ethan went absolutely still. Your wife, the man said. Rebecca Cole. He said to tell you he's sorry for your loss, and that he hopes you don't make any more losses necessary. The road was quiet. The two riders sat their horses and watched Ethan with the patient attention of men who are very good at what they do and know it. Ethan looked at the big man for a long moment. He thought about the rifle in his hands. He thought about Tucker's office and the 2-day deadline and the 6 families in the file. He thought about Lily standing in the middle of a trail with blisters on her feet, and Margaret's steady eyes across the firelight, and the rifle he'd kept across his knees all night while the fence line watcher stood in the dark outside. Tell Mr. Voss, he said very quietly, that he just made the second biggest mistake of his life. The big man's expression shifted. And the first? Coming after that family in the first place, Ethan said. He kept Ranger at a walk as he passed between them. He did not look back. He kept his pace steady, and his spine straight, and his rifle loose in his grip, and he listened with everything he had to the sound of 2 horses behind him, and heard them after a long moment turn and ride the other way. He rode the last 3 miles back to the Warren homestead with his jaw set and his mind running fast and cold, the way it used to run when he was about to make an arrest, and everything downstream from this moment had to be right. Lily was sitting on the fence post, the one he'd repaired yesterday when he came up the drive. She watched him come with her arms crossed over her chest, chin-up eyes tracking him with that particular child's radar for when an adult is carrying something heavy. What happened? She said. A conversation, he said. Nothing more. You look like it was more. He dismounted and tied Ranger and looked at this small person who had started all of this by standing in a road and refusing to move. Lily, he said, I need you to go inside and stay close to your mama tonight. I need you to do that without asking me a lot of questions right now. She studied him. Are they coming? He met her eyes honestly. I don't know, maybe, soon, but not tonight. How do you know not tonight? Because tonight they still think they can scare us off, he said. They won't move until they're sure that's not working. She was quiet for a moment. Is it working? He looked at her straight. No, he said. It isn't. She nodded once the way she always nodded when she'd decided something was true. Okay, she said. Then she got down from the fence post and went inside. He stood there a moment in the quiet of the afternoon. He turned the big man's words over in his mind. He knew Rebecca, and he felt the cold anger of it settle somewhere deep and permanent in the place where the things that cannot be undone are stored. Then he went to check the fence line, every inch of it. In the long gold light of the afternoon, he walked the entire perimeter of the Warren land with his eyes sharp and his mind working, and he began to plan. Because they had 2 days before Tucker was ready. 2 days in which Voss would be watching and waiting and deciding. And a man like Voss, a man who sent riders with messages about dead wives, was not going to stay patient much longer. That night, he didn't sit by the door. He sat outside on the porch step, with the rifle across his knees and his back to the cabin wall and his eyes on the dark. And at 2 in the morning, the dark gave back exactly what he'd expected. 4 riders. Coming slow from the east. Lamps unlit horses walking quiet. Spreading out as they came, 1 toward the barn, 1 toward the garden, 2 coming straight for the cabin. And in the lead rider's hand, catching the thin edge of moonlight as he raised it high, was something that burned. Ethan was off the porch step before the lead rider had covered another 20 yards. He didn't shout. He didn't warn. He fired one shot into the air, a single crack that split the night open like an axe through dry wood, and then he was moving low and fast, putting himself between the cabin and the two riders coming straight at it. "That's close enough," he said. His voice carried the way voices carry at 2 in the morning when everything else is silent. "Next one doesn't go up." The lead rider pulled his horse up hard. The burning thing in his hand, a torch oil-wrapped and fully lit, threw light across 4 faces that Ethan read in half a second. Not professionals. Hired men, the kind who signed on for intimidation work because it paid better than ranch work and seemed safer than it was. The big man from the road wasn't among them. Voss had sent the second tier tonight. That told Ethan something. "You're on private property," Ethan said. "Warren land. Deeded, registered, and documented in Helena. You want to set fire to it, you're committing arson on legitimately owned land in front of a witness. Think carefully about whether Voss is going to pay your legal fees when this goes wrong." The lead rider, young, maybe 25, with the uncertain eyes of someone who hadn't been told there would be a man with a rifle on the porch, looked at the torch in his hand like he was reconsidering the entire evening. The cabin door opened behind Ethan. He didn't turn. "Margaret, get back inside." "No." Her voice was flat and clear. She came to stand beside him. She was holding James Warren's shotgun in both hands, with the ease of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "This is my land," she said to the riders. "My husband broke this ground. My daughter was born here, and I am not moving." Silence. The torch crackled. One of the horses shifted and blew. The rider on the far left, the one who'd been angling toward the barn, had stopped moving entirely. "Last chance to make a different decision," Ethan said quietly. "Ride back to Voss and tell him it didn't work. That's the only offer on the table tonight." The lead rider looked at his men, looked at Ethan, looked at Margaret with the shotgun, and made the calculation that young men make when they realize the situation they rode into is not the situation they were told they were riding into. He turned his horse. The others followed. The torch went into the dirt as they left, dropped rather than carried back, which was the small dignity of men who needed to look like the retreat was a choice. Ethan watched them until the dark swallowed the sound of hooves and the night went quiet again. Then he exhaled slowly. "I told you to stay inside," he said. "You did." Margaret agreed. She lowered the shotgun. Her hands were perfectly steady. "That was a risk. So was lying in bed with a fever while strangers walked my fence line." She looked at him sidelong. "I'm done waiting inside while things happen to me, Ethan. I've been doing that for months, and it hasn't helped." He looked at her in the dark. At this woman who had been alone for 2 years and sick for 4 days and frightened for months, and who was standing in the dirt at 2 in the morning with a shotgun and a spine like iron. "Your husband taught you to shoot," he said. "He did." A pause. "I'm better than he was. He never told me that, but I knew." Something almost like a smile crossed Ethan's face. He turned back to where the torch smoldered in the dirt and went to stamp it out. "They'll be back," he said. "I know. Not tonight, but soon. Voss sent the second string tonight to test what we'd do. When they report back, he'll know the low-pressure approach is finished." He came back to the porch. "We're out of time for Tucker's 2 days. I need to ride to Helena myself." Margaret went still. "That's a 2-day ride. Day and a half if I push. And while you're gone, I'm going to leave you the papers," he said. "Hide them somewhere that isn't the Bible, somewhere Voss's men wouldn't think to look if they came inside. And I'm going to talk to the Calders before I leave." She stared at him. "The Calders won't." "Ed Calder watched his fence posts rot rather than pay a man to replace them," Ethan said. "I saw it when Lily walked me the fence line yesterday. He's not a man who lets things go to waste. He's a man who's scared. And scared men sometimes just need someone to show them the fear isn't as big as they thought it was." He paused. "I'm not asking him to fight. I'm asking him to watch. That's different." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. The night settled around them. Just insects now, just ordinary nighttime sounds. The world going back to its regular business, as if 4 men with a torch had never been there at all. "All right," she said finally. "Get some sleep. I'll leave at first light." She turned to go back inside. Then she stopped with her hand on the door and said without turning, "Be careful, Ethan. Not because we need you, because... She stopped, reconsidered. Just be careful. He watched her go in. He sat back down on the porch step with the rifle across his knees and stayed there until the sky started going gray, and then he went to saddle Ranger. He stopped at the Calder place on his way out. Ed Calder came to the door in his work clothes already up and looked at Ethan with the wary recognition of a man who knows a reckoning has arrived and has been half expecting it. "I know why you're here," Calder said before Ethan could speak. "Then you know what I'm going to say." Calder was a big man going soft with age, with the weathered face of genuine outdoor work and hands that knew what labor was. He looked past Ethan toward the Warren homestead in the distance. "My wife doesn't want trouble." "Your wife already has trouble," Ethan said. "All of you do. Voss isn't going to stop with the Warrens. You know that. You've known it." Calder's jaw worked. A man's got to think about his family. Margaret Warren's been thinking about hers alone for 2 years. Ethan kept his voice level. "She stood outside last night with a shotgun, while 4 of Voss's men came with a torch. Your neighbor, 6 miles down the road." The silence stretched. "I'm not asking you to go to war," Ethan said. "I'm asking you to watch the Warren place while I ride to Helena. You see trouble, you go to them, that's all. Can you do that?" Ed Calder looked at his hands. At the ground. At some point in the middle distance where a man looks when he's deciding who he is. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I can do that." Ethan nodded. "I'll be back in 3 days." He pushed Ranger hard on the trail to Helena, riding through the first day until the light failed, and camping fast and cold, and pushing again before dawn. His mind ran the whole way. Tucker, the documents. Judge Morrison, the 6 families in the file, Peters, and what he might have already told Voss. He turned it all over and organized it the way he'd once organized cases, building the structure of it, finding the load-bearing points. He arrived in Helena mid-afternoon of the second day and went straight to the territorial courthouse. Judge Augustus Morrison was a man in his late 60s who had been on the bench long enough to have seen every variety of human dishonesty and had arrived at a point of complete impatience with it. His clerk tried to tell Ethan he needed an appointment. Ethan put the Warren deed on the clerk's desk and said, "Tell the judge a former deputy marshal from Billings has documented fraud affecting 7 families in his territory and needs 20 minutes. He got 15. They ran 35. Morrison read the Warren documents. He read Tucker's summary, which Ethan had stopped to collect on his way through the county seat. Tucker had worked faster than expected, the file already organized and detailed and damning. Morrison read with the focused speed of a man who has trained himself to identify what matters and discard what doesn't. Then he set everything down and looked at Ethan over his reading glasses. "Voss has been operating this scheme for how long?" he said. "Best estimate 2 years, possibly longer. And Sheriff Dawes is either paid or coerced. Either way, he's not a resource." Morrison tapped his finger on the deed. "This document is unimpeachable. The Warren claim is solid. The fraud is clear." He paused. "It's the other families that will take time. Getting them to testify." "They'll come," Ethan said. "If they see the Warrens win, they'll come. People follow a first victory. They need to know it's possible before they'll risk it themselves." Morrison studied him. "You're confident." "I'm right," Ethan said. "And you know it." Another pause. Then Morrison called his clerk in and began dictating. "An emergency injunction. Voss's land claim against the Warren property suspended pending investigation. A warrant for examination of Voss's business records. Notification to the territorial marshal's office." It took 2 hours. When Ethan walked out of the courthouse, the sun was going down, and he had a certified copy of the injunction in his coat pocket and the weight of 3 days of hard riding in every muscle of his body. He slept 4 hours, then rode back. He made it to the Warren homestead on the afternoon of the 3rd day and heard the voices before he came through the cottonwoods. Not one voice, several. He came up the drive to find 3 wagons in the yard, the Calders and 2 other families he didn't recognize, and Ed Calder standing near the cabin door with his hat in his hands, talking to Margaret, who was standing straight and clear-eyed, with more color in her face than Ethan had seen since the fever. She looked up when Ranger came into the yard, and something moved across her face. Relief quickly contained, replaced by steadiness. But he'd seen it. "You made it," she said. "I said I would." He dismounted and reached into his coat. "Judge Morrison signed an injunction. Voss's claim is suspended. There's a territorial marshal coming to execute it within the week." The yard went quiet. Ed Calder stared at the paper in Ethan's hand. "That's legal and binding," Ethan said. "Voss can't move on this property or any of the other affected properties while the investigation is open. If he tries, he's in contempt of a territorial court order." One of the men from the other wagons, older with the look of someone who'd been carrying a weight for a long time, stepped forward. "You're talking about the Hester place too, and the Brennan family. Tucker's file covers all of them," Ethan said. "Every family Voss targeted is included in the investigation." The man's face did something complicated. He looked at his wife still on the wagon seat and then back at Ethan. Then he took off his hat and held it to his chest and didn't say anything because some things don't have words that fit them. Lily appeared in the cabin doorway and looked at Ethan with the specific assessment of someone checking that a person has returned in the same condition they left. Then she came off the porch and stood beside her mother. "Did it work?" she said. "It worked," he said. She nodded once slowly. Exactly the way she always nodded when she'd decided something was true. Then she went back inside because Lily Warren had never been a child who made a production of being right. The afternoon moved into evening, and the families in the yard didn't leave. Someone built a fire. Someone produced coffee. Ed Calder's wife, who had told Lily it wasn't safe to get involved, sat beside Margaret at the table outside and talked in a low voice for a long time. And whatever she said made Margaret press her lips together and look at the ground for a moment before she looked up and nodded. People made choices, and then they made different choices, and sometimes the second one was the one that told you who they actually were. Ethan sat on the fence post, Lily's fence post, the one she always chose, and drank his coffee and watched the fire, and listened to the sound of people talking who had stopped being afraid of the same thing on the same day. It was a particular sound. He'd heard it before at the end of hard cases, and it never sounded quite like anything else. Tucker arrived the following morning. He came with Peter's conspicuously absent fired the previous day. He told Ethan quietly for mishandling of client documents. Technically accurate, sufficient for the purpose. Peters had ridden out of town that same evening, which told them both everything they needed to know about where he was going and what he was saying. "Voss knows," Tucker said. "I expected that. He's been making inquiries about Judge Morrison, trying to find leverage. He won't find any." Ethan looked at the lawyer. Morrison didn't get to his position by being the kind of man who has leverage. Tucker sat up at the table outside and went through the documents with the families, one by one. The Hesters, the Brennans, two other couples. Ethan hadn't met. Each of them had a version of the same story. Each of them had a piece of evidence that fit against the others, like parts of a larger picture. Ethan sat with Margaret through most of it. Not to advise. Tucker didn't need his help, but because she'd asked him to stay close, and he understood that the asking had cost her something, and so he stayed. At one point between family, she turned to him and said very quietly, "How did you know Ed Calder would come?" "I didn't," he said. "I just knew he wasn't a man who wanted to be the person he'd been acting like. Sometimes that's enough." She thought about that. "You read people. 15 years of law enforcement. Is that why you knew the torchmen would leave last night, because you'd read them?" "Partly." He paused. "Partly because Voss hadn't sent his best. He was testing. Men who are testing don't commit to a fight they're not sure of." She looked at him. "And now that he knows testing didn't work. Now he has a court order between him and this property," Ethan said. "That changes the calculation." "Does it change the danger?" He met her eyes honestly. "Not yet, but it changes who's on the right side of the law, and that matters more than most people think." She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, Tucker's voice continued in its steady, careful way, building the legal structure of something that was going to outlast all of them. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah, thank you, not for the court order, not for the injunction or the fence or the—" She stopped. "For not riding past," she said. "That's what I'm saying. For not doing what everyone else did. He looked at the fire, at the families gathered around it, at Lily, who had come back outside and was sitting next to the older man from the other wagon with what appeared to be a serious conversation in progress, both of them leaning forward with their elbows on their knees in identical postures. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Why not?" "Because Voss hasn't been in a courtroom yet." He set down his cup. "And a man like that, a man who's built what he's built, doesn't go quietly into a judge's verdict." He paused. "He's going to try something before this gets to court. Something larger than 4 men with a torch." Margaret followed his gaze to the fire, to her daughter, to the families who had come because they'd finally decided that fear was heavier than risk. "Then we'd better be ready," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "We better had." 3 days later, the summons arrived from Helena. The Warren case had been formally docketed. Judge Morrison had set a hearing date. Tucker's filing named Voss, directly fraud, forgery, coercion, and 3 additional counts that the Territorial Attorney's Office had added once they'd seen the scope of the documentation. And attached to the summons in Morrison's precise handwriting was a note that said simply, "Bring the deed. Bring the witnesses. Come ready to finish this." Ethan read it twice. Then he handed it to Margaret. She read it standing at the table with both hands steady on the paper and her chin up and her eyes moving across the words with the focused intensity of someone who has waited a long time for a sentence to mean what she needs it to mean. Then she set it down and looked at Ethan. "Helena," she said. "Helena," he confirmed. She straightened her spine in that particular way she had not performance, just the physical expression of a decision being made in the body before it was finished, being made in the mind. "I'll need to arrange for someone to watch the property while we're gone." "Calder already offered." She looked at him. "You asked him already?" "Yesterday. He said yes before I finished the sentence." Ethan paused. "I told you. He wasn't the man he'd been acting like." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the outline of one, something that in another life and under different circumstances would have been easy and uncomplicated. "All right," she said. "Then we go to Helena." Lily appeared at the door. She had clearly been listening, but did not pretend otherwise. "We're going to court," she said. "Your mama is," Ethan said. "You're going with her. And you?" He picked up his hat from the table. "Someone has to make sure you get there in one piece." Lily looked at her mother. Margaret looked at Ethan. And in the quiet of the cabin, with the injunction on the table, and the deed in the Bible, and Tucker's file in a leather satchel by the door, the 3 of them understood without saying it that whatever came next was going to determine everything, and none of them were running from it. The road to Helena took 2 days, and Voss's men rode parallel to them for the first 6 miles. Ethan knew it before Lily did, before Margaret did, that particular instinct from 15 years of law work. The feeling of being watched from a distance that maintained itself at exactly the edge of comfort. He didn't say anything. He adjusted his angle slightly, kept Ranger between the wagon and the tree line, and watched the shapes that moved in his peripheral vision until they didn't anymore. When they stopped to water the horses at midday, Margaret came to stand beside him and said very quietly, "We had company this morning." "We did." "They're gone now." "For now." He checked the cinch on Ranger's saddle. "He's trying to rattle us before we get to the courtroom. If we look scared walking in, it gives him something." "I'm not scared," she said. He looked at her. "I know you're not." "I'm angry," she said. "There's a difference." "There is," he agreed, "and anger is more useful in a courtroom." Lily was sitting on the wagon seat eating a biscuit with the methodical focus of someone refueling rather than eating. Watching the tree line with the same peripheral awareness she'd probably learned from sleeping too many nights in a house where she was the only one awake. At 8 years old, she'd developed instincts that most adults never got. Ethan wasn't sure whether to be proud of her or furious on her behalf that she'd had to develop them. Both, he decided. Both at once. They arrived in Helena the evening of the 2nd day, and Tucker met them at the boarding house he'd arranged. He had the look of a man who had not slept adequately in several days and had decided that was acceptable given the circumstances. He had the final version of the filing with him organized into sections that he walked Margaret through at the table after supper, while Lily sat beside her mother and read every page that passed in front of her, with a focused attention. That Tucker, midway through his explanation, began directing his remarks toward equally. "The other families," Ethan said. "Hester, Brennan, the others." "They're here," Tucker said. "All of them. Arrived this afternoon. I put them at the hotel on 2nd Street. He paused. "I wasn't certain they'd come. I think your injunction was." "What did it, Ethan?" "Once they saw that a court had taken it seriously, they believed it was real." "How many total witnesses?" 11, between the 6 families. He looked at his papers. The territorial attorney added 3 of his own. There's also a land office clerk from the registration office who's prepared to testify that Voss's original documents were filed after the Warren deed, and use the same witness names, which is legally impossible since 2 of those witnesses had already died before the date on Voss's papers. Margaret's head came up sharply. "He used dead men as witnesses." "He did," Tucker said. "He apparently didn't expect anyone to cross-reference the dates against the county death records." He allowed himself a small, precise expression of satisfaction. "That was a mistake." "A large one," Ethan said. "Morrison knows," Tucker said. "I sent him the cross-reference last night. He didn't reply, but he didn't need to. The man reads everything. He'll be prepared." Margaret looked at the papers spread across the table. At the deed. At the witness list. At the organized, documented evidence of 9 years of work, and 2 years of fear, and 4 days of fever, and a girl walking barefoot through summer heat, because every other option had closed. She looked at all of it laid out in Tucker's careful hand, and she was quiet for a long time. "Will it be enough?" she said. "Yes," Tucker and Ethan said simultaneously. She looked between them. Something almost like a laugh moved across her face, quick and surprised and real, the first genuinely unguarded expression he'd seen from her that wasn't pain or anger, or the controlled steadiness she wore like armor. "All right," she said. "Then we finish it." The courtroom the next morning was fuller than any of them had expected. Word traveled fast in a territorial capital, and the case had been talked about in the land office, in the attorney's offices, in the boarding houses, where rangemen and homestead families stayed when they came to the city. People had heard about the injunction. People had heard about Tucker's filing. And people who had their own reasons to pay attention to Clayton Voss's business dealings had decided they wanted to see what happened when someone finally stood up and said enough. Voss was already seated when Ethan brought Margaret and Lily through the door. He was a large man, larger than Ethan had pictured, built with the particular solidity of someone who had used physical presence as a tool for a long time and found it effective. He had a lawyer beside him, expensive-looking, from the Capitol. He had 2 men behind him in the gallery who had the same flat professional eyes as the riders who'd come to the Warren fence line in the dark. He looked at Margaret when she walked in. She looked back at him. She didn't look away. She walked to her seat with her spine straight and her chin level and her eyes forward, and she sat down and folded her hands on the table in front of her and did not look at Voss again. Lily sat beside her. She did look at Voss, a long, steady, assessing look that seemed to make the large man slightly uncomfortable in a way that no adult's gaze had managed. Children see things plainly, without the filter of social training that tells adults to soften their perception. Lily Warren had decided what Clayton Voss was a long time ago, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Ethan sat behind them in the gallery. Tucker was at the table. The Hester family was 3 rows back. The Brennans beside them. The other families arranged through the room like a structure that had been built quietly, piece by piece, over months of fear, and was only now being revealed as what it actually was. Judge Morrison came in, and the room stood and sat and went quiet. I was older up close than he'd seemed across a desk. Older and more worn in the specific way of men who have carried public responsibility for a long time and allowed it to cost them something. He arranged his papers. He looked at Tucker's table. He looked at Voss's table. He looked at the gallery with the calm, comprehensive gaze of a man taking inventory. Then he said, "We'll begin." Tucker opened for the Warren family with the deed. He walked Morrison through the documentation with the methodical clarity of a man who had been building to this moment for months and intended to waste none of it. The deed, the filing date, the registration records, the cross-reference with the death records showing Voss's forged witness signatures. He laid each piece down in sequence, building the case, the way a craftsman builds a wall, each piece fitting against the last, the whole structure becoming undeniable as it rose. Voss's lawyer objected 3 times in the first 20 minutes. Morrison overruled all 3 without deliberation, which told Ethan that Tucker's briefing the previous night had been thorough, and the judge had come to the courtroom already knowing the shape of what he was going to hear. Then Tucker called Margaret to the stand. She walked to the witness chair, the way she walked everywhere, like the ground was hers to walk on, like no one had given her permission and no one needed to. She sat down and looked at Tucker and waited. Tucker took her through it carefully. The visit in March, Voss's men, the documents he'd presented, the debt he'd claimed, the fear, the isolation, the fever that had come on in the weeks after when the weight of it had gotten too heavy to carry standing up. She answered every question in the same clear, unvarnished voice. No performance, no dramatics, just the plain sequential truth delivered by a woman who had lived every word of it and didn't need to embellish what was already devastating. Voss's lawyer stood for cross-examination and tried 3 different angles to suggest that Margaret had misunderstood the nature of Voss's visit, that the debt claim had been made in good faith, that her husband might have borrowed money she wasn't aware of. Each time, Margaret answered with the specific, detailed patience of someone who has had months to think about these exact questions. Mrs. Warren, Voss's lawyer said, in the tone men use when they're about to suggest a woman's memory is unreliable. Is it possible you were confused about the nature of... No, Margaret said, flat and immediate. It is not possible. He stood in my kitchen and told me my family's land wasn't my family's land. A woman does not forget the details of that conversation. A sound moved through the gallery. Not loud, just present. The lawyer tried once more. Your husband's financial records. My husband kept every record he ever made, Margaret said. You have seen them. The court has seen them. There is no debt. There was never a debt. The only document in this case that doesn't hold up is the one your client created. Morrison allowed it. He looked at Voss's lawyer with an expression that said the cross-examination was not improving anyone's position and might be concluded. The lawyer sat down. Tucker called the land office clerk next. The testimony about the forged witness signatures took 12 minutes and was the most quietly devastating 12 minutes Ethan had ever witnessed in a courtroom. The clerk was a small man with precise speech and an accountant's love of specificity, and he walked Morrison through the impossibility of Voss's documents with the calm certainty of someone who has checked their numbers 4 times and is confident in the result. Voss's lawyer did not cross-examine. He conferred with his client in a low, rapid voice instead, and Voss's face during that conference was the face of a man who is recalculating and finding the numbers don't work the way they used to. Then Tucker called the Hester family, and then the Brennans, and then the others, one by one. Each of them telling a version of the same story, the same visit, the same fabricated debt, the same 2 men standing behind Voss while he delivered his message, the same pressure, the same fear, the same silence from neighbors and lawmen and everyone who might have helped. With each family that took the stand, Voss became more still. Not calmer, stiller in the way that things go still before they break. His lawyer had stopped conferring with him. The 2 men in the gallery behind him had stopped doing the professional thing with their eyes and had started looking at the exits. Ethan watched all of it from his seat in the gallery. He watched Voss's face. He watched the jury of assembled fact building itself in the room, inescapable, undeniable. He watched Judge Morrison's pen moving across his notes with a steady, continuous motion that did not pause or hesitate. And then Tucker stood up one final time and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Lily Warren." The room shifted. Voss's lawyer was on his feet immediately. "Objection. The witness is a minor." "She is," Tucker said calmly. "She is also the person who documented the condition of the Warren fence line, maintained the household during her mother's illness, and walked 12 miles barefoot to seek assistance when every adult option had been exhausted. I believe the court will find her testimony relevant. Morrison looked at Lily. Lily looked at Morrison with her steady, serious gaze and did not look away. I'll hear her, Morrison said. She walked to the stand like it was a fence post she'd decided to sit on. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap exactly the way she'd seen her mother do it and looked at Tucker and waited. Tucker was gentle with her. He asked simple questions and let her answers be what they were without shaping them. What did she see when Voss came to the cabin? What did her mother do after? What happened when her mother got sick? Who did she go to for help? She answered everything plainly. The Calders, Reverend Holt, Dr. Briggs, Sheriff Dawes. 6 miles to town, 6 miles back. Blisters on her feet, and the particular arithmetic of a child who has run out of options and is down to one last chance she isn't sure will work. And when you stopped Mr. Cole on the road? Tucker said. What made you think he would help when everyone else had refused? Lily was quiet for a moment. The courtroom was very still. I didn't think he would, she said. I just thought he was the last one. And if the last one said no, then at least I'd tried all of them. She paused. But he didn't say no. Tucker nodded. Thank you, Lily. That's all. Voss's lawyer stood for cross-examination and looked at this 8-year-old girl on the witness stand and made the first intelligent decision he'd made all morning. He sat back down without saying a word. Morrison called a recess. In the hallway outside, Ethan found Lily standing next to her mother with her arms crossed and her chin up, already returned to her default state of contained, watchful calm. Margaret had her hand on Lily's shoulder and was looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone waiting for a verdict who has done everything they can do and is now at the mercy of what happens next. Ethan came and stood beside them. You did well in there, he said to Lily. I just told what happened, she said. That's exactly what doing well means. She considered that. Do you think we'll win? Yes, he said. I do. She looked up at him. How sure? Sure enough, he said. She nodded once in that way she had. Then she took her mother's hand, and they stood together and waited. The recess ran 40 minutes. When Morrison came back and the room settled, he did not make a production of it. He looked at his notes. He looked at the assembled families in the gallery. He looked at Tucker's table and Voss's table with the same level unreadable attention. Then he began to speak. I went through the evidence systematically. The deed, the registration, the forged witnesses, the pattern of visits, the consistency of the fabricated debt claims across 7 separate families. His voice was measured, and his sentences were precise, and he did not editorialize. He didn't need to. The facts editorialized themselves. The claim made by Clayton Voss against the Warren property, Morrison said, is not supported by any legitimate documentation. It is contradicted by registered territorial records, by witness testimony, and by forensic examination of the documents submitted in Voss's name, which have been demonstrated to contain impossible witness signatures. He paused. The court finds entirely for the plaintiff. The Warren land claim stands as registered. Voss's claim is dismissed in its entirety. It wasn't finished. Furthermore, the pattern of conduct documented in this proceeding constitutes fraud upon multiple families across this territory. I am referring the full record to the territorial attorney for criminal prosecution. I am also issuing an order for examination of all land transactions associated with Clayton Voss in this territory over the preceding 3 years. Morrison looked directly at Voss for the first time since the proceeding had begun. This court does not look favorably on men who use fabricated legal instruments to take what belongs to others. This territory was built by people who broke ground and planted and built, and the law exists to protect that work, not to be used as a weapon against it. He brought his gavel down once. The sound of it in that room was the cleanest sound Ethan had heard in a long time. Voss stood up. His chair scraped back, and he stood, and for a moment the room held its breath, because a man who has been publicly dismantled has choices about what he does next, and not all of those choices are rational. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. Voss looked at it, looked at the gallery, looked at all the families who had come and sat and testified, and were now looking back at him with the particular expression of people who have stopped being afraid. He sat back down, and something left the room with his sitting, some pressure, some weather, some force that had been pressing down on all of them for months and months, suddenly simply gone. Margaret turned in her seat and found Ethan's eyes. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He nodded once. She turned back and pressed her hand over her mouth for just a moment, just one, and then she took it away and straightened her spine and put her arm around Lily. Lily looked up at her mother. Then she looked over at the gallery where the Hester family sat, and the Brennans and the others, all of them quiet in the way of people who haven't fully processed yet that the thing they feared has stopped, and she said to no one in particular, in her plain 8-year-old voice, "Good." Outside the courthouse. Tucker shook Ethan's hand for a long time without speaking. The other families came out in ones and twos and stood in the street with the uncertain blinking quality of people stepping into different air. The Hester man. The older one who'd taken his hat off the day Tucker read them. The injunction came over to Margaret and said something quiet to her that made her nod and grip his hand briefly and nod again. Voss came out last, flanked by his lawyer and his 2 men from the gallery. He looked at Ethan across the width of the street. Ethan looked back. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. Voss knew, and Ethan knew that he knew that the architecture of what he'd built was coming down. Not just the Warren claim, not just the fraudulent deeds, but all of it brick by brick, case by case, as the territorial attorney worked through what Morrison had handed him. Voss turned and got into his carriage and drove away, and within the month he would be facing criminal charges, and within the year his name would mean something different in that territory than it had, not power, not influence, not the quiet fear his visits generated, but the specific kind of notoriety that attaches to men who overreached and lost publicly in a courtroom in front of everyone who mattered. But that was later. Right now he just drove away. Ethan watched him go. Lily appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his, without preamble or announcement, the way children do when they've decided something and don't see the need to make a speech about it. He looked down at her. She was watching the carriage disappear with the same steady assessment she brought to everything. "Is it over?" she said. "The worst of it," he said. "Yes." "What about the rest of it?" "I thought about that. About the fence line that needed continued watching, and the property that would need care through the coming winter, and the garden that was struggling but alive, and the barn door that still listed slightly, even after his repair, and the cat that had decided the cabin was its permanent home, and the Bible on the shelf with the deed inside it that was now irrevocably safely the Warren family's. He thought about Margaret's face across the firelight when she'd said thank you for not riding past. He thought about a gray-haired quarter horse that had stopped without being told in the middle of a hot summer trail because something had been worth stopping for. The rest of it, he said, is just living. Lily seemed to find that acceptable. She kept his hand and didn't let go. Margaret came to stand on his other side. The 3 of them stood together in the Helena Street while Tucker gathered his papers behind them, and the Hester family and the Brennans talked among themselves, and the ordinary business of the territorial capital went on around them, indifferent to the fact that something had just been settled that had needed settling for a long time. "We should start back tomorrow," Margaret said. "The Calders have the property, but I don't like leaving it too long." "Tomorrow," Ethan agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About the North Pasture. It's been sitting unused for 2 years. James always meant to put cattle on it, but he ran out of time." She paused, and in the pause was the weight of everything. James Warren had run out of time for, and the quiet grief of a woman who had long since made peace with carrying that weight and chosen to carry it forward rather than stay still under it. "I think it's time to use it." Ethan looked at her. At the level way she was looking back at him. At the question that wasn't quite a question. The offer that wasn't quite an offer. The opening that a woman like Margaret Warren would only make once and would not make smaller than she'd made it. "You'd need someone who knows cattle," he said. "I'd need someone who knows a lot of things," she said. "Fence lines, legal documents, when to sit by a door with a rifle, and when to go to Helena." She held his gaze. "Someone who isn't going anywhere." Lily, still holding his hand, said nothing. She looked up at the sky with the studious attention of a child who is pointedly not appearing to listen. Ethan looked at Ranger tied at the post nearby. At the road south. At the flat, familiar emptiness of a horizon he'd been riding toward for 7 years without arriving anywhere. Then he looked at Margaret. "I reckon I know cattle well enough," he said. Something settled in her face. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but the quiet, certain expression of a decision that was always going to be made and has finally been made, the recognition of something that was already true, being spoken aloud for the first time. "All right then," she said. Lily squeezed his hand once hard, and then let go and walked back toward Tucker with the brisk purposefulness of a child who has accomplished what she set out to accomplish and is now ready to move on to the next thing. Ethan watched her go. I thought about the day she had stood in a trail in the summer heat with blisters on her feet and decided that the last stranger on the road was worth stopping. He thought about what it meant to be the person someone chooses when they're out of choices, the weight of that, and the grace of it. He thought about Rebecca, who had called him the only man she ever met, who was more useful than he was trouble, and who had known him well enough to mean it as the highest possible compliment. I thought she would have liked Lily Warren considerably. He thought she would have respected Margaret Warren in the way she'd respected very few people. He thought she would have told him in her clear and uncomplicated way that stopping was exactly right, and riding on would have been exactly wrong, and what took you so long? He picked up his hat from where he'd been holding it and set it on his head. The road back to the Warren homestead was 2 days south. The north pasture needed cattle. The barn door still listed. The garden needed tending before the summer ended. There was a community of families who had just discovered that standing together was possible, and that discovery was fragile in the way of new things and needed to be reinforced before it faded. There was work to do. Real work, the kind that built something instead of just moving through it. Ethan Cole had been moving through things for 7 years. He was done with that now. The man who had once ridden past everything that asked something of him had learned somewhere between a dusty summer trail and a territorial courtroom that the things worth stopping for were the things that made the stopping mean something, and that a home was not a place you were born into, but a place you chose with your whole self on purpose, even when choosing it cost you the safety of the road. He had stopped. He had stayed. He had fought for something that wasn't his and discovered in the fighting that it was. And for Ethan Cole, that was not the end of a journey. It was the first day of one worth taking.